My name is Yusuf Marzook. I'm a professor in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. And so I actually have some perspective perhaps on the graduate student experience because I did my graduate education at MIT as well in mechanical engineering, as well as my undergraduate degree. So I've been here a while. Yeah, so I look forward to chatting with you and sharing experience perhaps from the engineering side of the campus.
So I'm David Bartel, and I'm a professor of biology, and my lab is at the Whitehead Institute, which is across the street from the Cancer Center. My lab works on how genes are regulated, and we focus on small RNAs that influence the regulation of your genes and most of your genes in your cells.
Hi, my name is Roshni Kapadia. I'm a MBA 2014 second year at the MIT Sloan School of Management, so the other side of campus. Before coming to Sloan, I worked in economic consulting for 5 years on pharmaceutical litigation, and before that I was in your shoes. Well, maybe not your shoes, but I was an undergrad at Wellesley, and I majored in economics there. So I can talk to you a little bit about whether an MBA is a good idea for you, or whether or not some coursework over at Sloan is a good idea while you're here as well.
Hi, I'm Shuo. I'm a PhD student in EECS, and my research focuses on networks and mobile systems. And now I'm also working for a startup called Jerry Joy. So I'm happy to share my experience on either a PhD study or startups. And yeah, before she asked any questions, actually I suggest the people who want to do PhD to read a book called The PhD Grind. I don't know whether you've heard of it or not. You can Google it. So yeah, so I think it's, so it talks about PhD's life in computer science and kind of a miserable life. So yeah, I suggest, yeah, so I read it during this summer, and I hope I can read, I read it earlier, so yeah.
Right, so I'll probably start off with my questions right now, and then at the end of it, after I've asked my own questions, you can please feel free to ask any question that you have for the panelists. So before I start off, thank you for the to the panelists for coming, and to everyone in the audience also. So I have a list of questions here that should cover the vital aspects of this theme. And so my first question to the panelists: what makes a student a good fit in a research lab, and how does a professor usually decide that?
Go ahead.
Sure. So I think this depends a lot on the research lab, obviously, and it depends on the style of the PI and on the culture of the group that the student is going to join. I can tell you what I look at, and then maybe some broader comments. I guess when I'm looking for a student, I like to talk with students. So in Aeroastro, we actually have to some extent, pick students in the spring after admissions happen, because we have to make RA offers before students arrive on campus. Not always, but the majority of the time. So then I end up talking with students before they've actually permanently set foot at MIT. And the thing that I look for is really ability to engage in a dialogue about research and some spark in terms of discussing problems. So from my perspective, what makes a good graduate student is someone with whom we can have a lot of back and forth. If we're talking about something, someone who asks questions, who injects ideas, someone that feels sort of active and engaged, and who is going to be more than just a pair of hands, but someone who actually is going to help start to take ownership of a problem. Now, that's, when people decide who's going to join their lab, I think you inevitably make those decisions based on very limited information, a conversation here and there, some information on paper. There's always a gamble on both sides, I think, both in terms of the student sort of deciding what lab you're going to cast your foot into, you definitely make that information under limited information, and also on the faculty side. But I think the challenge is really try to get as much information as you can given the constraints. But I think what makes a good student in the long run in the lab, in my lab certainly, is someone who has a lot of intellectual curiosity. I think that's probably true of every single lab at MIT. Someone who can take ownership of a problem, someone who's collaborative, who'll work with others, because a lot of the learning goes on, not from sitting in my office and talking about stuff, but talking with your peers, talking with your fellow lab mates. Sometimes, people in my group come to me and they say, we've been discussing this idea, we think we should do this, and that's fantastic. I mean, my students have far better ideas than I do, and I love that. And that's, I think, what makes a healthy group, an interesting group, and that's the kind of spark that I look for when I'm looking at students.
So, yeah, I think that's a lot of what I'm looking for. And in my case, one of the most important things is this somebody that I enjoy talking with? Because if I'm going to take somebody in my lab, I'm going to be spending many hours over the next 5, maybe 4 years talking with that person, and if I don't enjoy it, I just don't want to do it. And so that's one thing. I also look at the record of the student, and in biology we also have what we call lab rotations. So before a graduate student joins the lab, they spend a month in the lab doing a very small research project and just checking for themselves how much they like the types of things that are going on in the lab, as well as it gives the lab a chance to get a sense of the personality and the abilities and the, I guess, type of person that might be joining in. So we have a bit more information, but it's still, sometimes I'm surprised at after a few years, which students that I thought would be at the very top and aren't always the ones that I had thought would be after the 1 year rotation. I'm sorry, did I say 1 year? 1 month rotation.
Right. So maybe as a follow-up to what Professor Marzook said, so is it a good idea to discuss and have things set right at the beginning when you do sign in students, such as stipend issues, and then just having a very frank discussion with the student as to what you would expect, and to make sure that always happens? That's probably a good idea.
I think, certainly, I guess the practicalities stipends and things like that should certainly, that should be well established. Faculty sometimes can't make a commitment of funding that's, 5 years of funding, but they can say, we're going, from semester to semester, or we have a longer term source of funding, so you should be okay. I think it is important to chat about that. I think sometimes some students get pretty anxious about knowing exactly what they're going to work on, or what exactly is my project going to be. They want to see things that are very well defined, but sometimes that's difficult. I think sometimes we begin with a problem that's pretty open-ended, and then we see as the students' interests, what resonates and where the research takes us, and projects morph over time. So I think it's nice to have some expectation that things are going to be in outline well defined, but also I think it's important to be able to roll with it a little bit. And
so in case midway between the semester, a student realizes that the lab was probably not a very good choice to make, then from the professor's point of view, how would you deal with that? And also from the student's point of view, how would you go and approach the professor about this problem that you're having?
I think it's if the sooner you realize that a lab is not the right fit, the better. And but if it's been a half a year or 3 years, it's really, I think it's a really good idea to switch labs. And from my perspective, if there's a student in my lab who doesn't want to be there, I want them to find a better place. And And I don't want that spot to be taken by somebody who doesn't want to be there. There are other people who could fill that spot. So from the professor's perspective, I mean, it might depend on the lab, but I'd be very surprised if in most of the cases that's going to be the case, right? If somebody doesn't want to be there, then it's much better for them to find another lab than to stay, from everybody's perspective.
And like oftentimes when a student, perhaps later on in the year, if they decide that they don't want to continue with the lab, then they have problems finding other sources of funding. So could you shed some light on what a student could do in that situation? I personally know of some
If you're asking me, I mean, it's a little bit different in biology, where all the students are funded, and they're funded regardless of which lab they're in, and they choose the lab because of that pool of funding that's used. They choose their lab rather, maybe in the spring after their first year. Okay, and so other departments where students can only go to labs with funding, it's more complicated, I think. But it's these switches from one lab to another, I think, are much less complicated in a department where the funding is just guaranteed.
Okay.
I mean, so in Aeroastra, where typically you have to have funding to move somewhere, it is more complicated, but it's certainly possible. And I would echo exactly what was said, that if you're not happy being in a lab, if you have some issues, it's important to communicate about them. It's important not to let problems fester. So it's important to be very open and honest with your advisor, because I've had students come to my lab from other faculties' research groups, and vice versa. I've had some of my students go into other faculty, and honestly, there's no hard feelings about it. I actually feel happy when I know a student of mine who wasn't sort of particularly happy with their project has gone on to another lab and is thriving there, and I've seen that, and that's fantastic. So as far as transitioning goes, your advisor can help. So you can say, when we talk about, why, this project doesn't seem so suited to your interests, I'd like to look at something else, then, your advisor can suggest, well, why don't you talk to so-and-so and so-and-so? We can talk to those people also, sort of try to pave the way. One can always, if you need some transitional time, you could always TA for a semester or something like that. But in general, I think talking about problems early will ensure that your advisor wants to help you land in a good place, and I think we're happy to do that.
Thanks a lot. My next question focuses on what happens after a student joins a lab, and there are a lot of issues that they have to work out between each other, the professor and the student. And one very big problem is as to how to balance coursework and research work. And different professors have different perspectives of this thing. So as an advisor, how would you advise them to go about this?
Well, I think it's really important to use the courses to fill in any gaps, and the students know best what gaps those are. It's also, at least in our field, the grades you get in those courses will never be looked at. So nobody, as far as I know, nobody's going to be looking at any grade that you end up getting in a graduate course. And so the reason for doing well in the course really shouldn't have anything to do with wanting to get a high grade. Those days, that was sort of your undergraduate experience, and I don't think, maybe it's different in other departments, but in for a biology PhD, you need to pass the course, but that's all. And so you can prioritize based on what gaps you want to fill, what expertise you want to gain in the courses. And then, of course, there's a lot of benefit to doing the research, and so it's basically your call.
Well, for example, in certain departments, like Department of Mechanical Engineering, where I belong to, we have to clear quals being an MS student in order to go on to PhD. And at that time, it's quite important to have good grades there. So a lot of people in the beginning have a lot of problems trying to, and some people are often like very vehement about doing just coursework because they feel that there's no point in trying to attempt research without having a good, solid background. So I've seen that a couple of times. So what would you say about that?
I mean, in my case, I was when I was a graduate student, I was very much wanting to do very well in those courses, and I actually I had 8 required courses. I ended up taking 12, okay, because I had a lot of gaps to fill, because my background is a little bit unusual. And so, courses are very important, and if that's what's right for you, that's what you should be doing. I guess I don't know what else to say. We also have the prelim exam, but it doesn't really hinge on the grades that you got. It's just focusing on, you know, how you solve problems in an oral exam, and how you, you know, the write-up that you do and how you solve those problems and how you answer the questions during the exam. But there's not a real tie-in to the course grades.
Okay.
In Aeroaster, it's a similar setup. I think in Aeroaster you have to have a certain GPA to be allowed to take the prelims.
Yes.
4.4, I believe. One can petition if your GPA is a bit below that. But again, I think that's kind of maybe the early phase of graduate school where those grades really matter. And I've seen people who have 5.0 GPAs who don't do so well in the quals. And I've seen people who are right on the borderline who do fantastically well in the quals. But and again, I think that's kind of an early transient phase, even in engineering. In the long run, I agree, no one really cares what your course grades were. I mean, by the time you get your PhD, I don't think it matters at all. What matters at that point are your research contributions, your publication record, your ideas. I think that's what's going to
And the letter from your advisor.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Maybe you guys could chime in on these things.
So from a student's perspective, could you just shed some light on what you experienced in trying to keep a balance between coursework and research work in your initial days as a grad student?
Well, actually, my background is also kind of unusual. I also took a lot of courses, so we are required to take 4 courses, but I end up taking 8. So, yeah, actually, I enjoy those courses. I think sometimes it feels like kind of relaxing from your research, because the difference between taking courses and doing research is during the course you are trying to solve the problems that have already been solved, and during the research you are trying to solve problems that no one knows how to solve. So yeah, sometimes you may find it really difficult to research. Maybe you get stuck on some certain things, and then at that point I usually go back to courses, maybe solve those problems or write some code. It's kind of how to say, I feel some kind of achievement. So yeah, and make me feel better. Make me feel I'm not that bad PhD student. Yeah, and also I took those courses because it helps to fill my knowledge gaps between my background and my current research, and I can also get so I can also get ideas that can help in my research during those courses. So yeah, so I think when you take the course, maybe most of the time you shouldn't think I have to take the course. Maybe you should say I want to take the course. If you think it that way, you won't feel a lot of pressure on taking courses versus research.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll go on to my next question now about the personal relationship between a professor and his or her student. So first of all, what kind of relationship do you think should exist on a personal basis? And in case there is a communication gap between the professor, which often happens if the professor is slightly senior and he doesn't really have all that time to spend with his students, then how should a student go about like trying to resolve that communication gap?
Well, I think, there's many different kinds of relationships between professors and students, and maybe it depends on the age of the professor, maybe it just depends on personal dynamics, but I think that, in a very important sense, you're colleagues. We're working on problems together. I think it should be a friendly relationship. There are times when, as a faculty member, you need to kind of tell your students something that they don't necessarily want to hear. Some advice, you haven't been doing so much of this. I really think, this didn't go so well. We need to work on that. So it has to be a relationship where you can say those things, but where they're construed and meant constructively, and where, you can walk away from those conversations and feel like, okay, that we both have each other's interests in mind. So I think, I think I'm try to be very friendly with my students, and I think most of my colleagues do the same. Again, going back to your earlier question about if there are problems that are interfering with research or with your sort of progress through graduate school in some way, I think it's important to have a relationship where you can discuss those things. But again, it's something that you need to feel out, and I think every faculty member might have a slightly different style on it. There's a second part of your question.
Yeah, I mean, in case, in an extreme situation that there is a communication gap, then how would a student try and approach the professor and get more, more communication with him?
Yeah. Well, again, so I think both the faculty member and the student, should try to communicate with each other as effectively as possible. Some people, maybe you have a hard time getting your ideas across in a one-on-one meeting. So maybe you go back and you reflect on it, and then you sort of lay out what you'd like to write in an email. And maybe that, is a way of opening a dialogue that you weren't able to do in person. So you need to find what works for you. But I think, whatever you can do to get through those kinds of communication gaps is very important.
So, Shu, from your perspective as a student, what kind of relation do you have with your professor, and how do you think it could be improved, or what is your advice to people in regard to developing a good and constructive kind of relationship with your advisor?
So as the professor just said, so the relationship between students and professor are so different. So among students and amongst professors. So I think my relationship with my professor is kind of like feels like my professor is like a project manager, and I'm the one who actually working on those projects. So every time when we meet, I talk about what I've done recently, and he helps me to point out the correct direction for next steps. So so actually I think my startup experience kind of helped me to improve this relationship, because I in the startup I lead a technical team, so I'm the project manager, and I'm talking with my staff. Then I will know what I want to hear from them. And then, so when I then go back talk to my professors, I try to be professional, and I try to ask the most important questions, because the professors are always busy. So maybe they will only have 1 hour or half an hour to talk to you every week, or even every other week. So it's my responsibility to make sure I get most from this meeting. So So after I doing the startup, I kind of prepare more before my meeting with my advisor, so to make sure that to make sure there is no communication gap I make sure he knows what I'm working on, and I can get the most valuable advice from him.
Thanks. So now we've been speaking about the research aspect a lot, but I think it's also important to address what happens when you're a TA. So from the professor's side, when you are working with a TA, what kind of knowledge background do you expect from the TA with respect to the course that you're taking? And what other kind of tasks would you think is required of a TA to perform in order to do well as a TA?
I mean, the TAs in our case, they're assigned by the department to the course. So we're not selecting TAs generally, but you know, I think that when you're TAing a course, you just want to. I think everybody remembers pretty well what it's like to be a student and who the two good TAs were and which were the TAs that really did not do a good job, and you want to be one of those TAs that the students appreciate. I think that there are cases where I can imagine cases where the load on the TA is unreasonable, and there you have to communicate that either with the department or your professor or the professor of the course. Maybe your advisor can help you in that. But I think as I guess TAs and students, you guys probably know better than I do, you know, what it takes.
Right. So, like usually, if you're taking a course, would you be expected to come with a very good knowledge base, or is it more like learning along with the students and trying to help the professor at the same time?
I mean, I think to some extent you could be learning along, but in my mind that's a little bit dangerous because a TA needs to lend clarity to what's going on. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, and as I'm sure you know, the TAs that would confuse things would sometimes do a lot more harm than good. So you don't want to be one of those TAs. The TAs who can sort of clarify and distill and help you practice are fantastic, sometimes more useful than the instructor. So that takes a little bit of perspective to be able to do that. And I think if you're seeing the course material for the first time, it may be difficult to have that perspective. Not always, but it's more difficult.
Right. So now I'm going to go on to a different nature of question about how students should go about planning their future. And so what consideration should a student take in deciding what to do after their MS degree, for example? And here I would like to bring in Roshni. And how many people do you see taking up an MBA course during their PhD, or even taking up MBA after MS or PhD?
I think it's actually fairly common for people to do an MBA after doing a master's. It's a good fit. There are actually programs at Sloan where you can do two at the same time. A PhD in and of itself with an MBA would be probably overkill. But what I do see students doing is doing management coursework during their PhDs. So especially after maybe you've finished a lot of the coursework you would take to be able to do your research, then you can think about, while you're doing your research, fitting in coursework from the management school that will help you with your future. So for example, one of the classes I took, strategic decision making in the biomedical business, which I mentioned a little earlier, half the class was PhDs, and then a few medical students from Harvard Medical School. And then there were the MBAs, of course. And my team was half PhDs and half MBA students. And what we were learning how to do in that class was learning how to commercialize innovations in research. So, and how to value them and how to make decisions. So if you were to go on ever in your life to need to work with a venture capital firm, which you almost surely will have to do if you start a company or want to commercialize your idea, you'll be able to speak their language and approach it with a framework. There are other courses you might want to take too, some of the basic finance courses, some of the advanced finance courses to learn how to value ideas. You might want to take a marketing course. I know some PhD friends who've taken marketing classes. I would recommend taking strategy courses. There's a great class called Entrepreneurial Strategy that very few MBAs even know about, but it is an excellent class for figuring out how to take what you're doing here out into the world and how best to do that.
Okay, and this kind of brings me to my next question. So apart from entrepreneurship, what other aspects would doing MBA courses or taking up an MBA help? I mean, would it also be a good thing for people who want to go on to doing jobs? So basically, what are the advantages of doing MBA courses along with your scientific work?
Well, I mean, you have the great opportunity here of having a very analytical management program. MIT Sloan's courses are meant to offer breadth, not depth, but that said, if you've never taken finance in your life, it's going to feel like depth as well. The pace is, it's probably not as rigorous as what you guys are used to over here, so, but it still will challenge you just from that breadth versus depth angle. I think the value is in filling gaps that you might not even perceive as necessary at the moment. Does that kind of get to the answer of your
Yeah.
question?
Sure. And so my next question
Can I follow up on?
Yeah.
So I guess there's a tension between getting the MBA right away together with your other education, or getting some experience first and then going to business school.
Yeah.
How do students decide?
Well, I can tell you about the typical path of an MBA student, and it's a little different. So an MBA student typically at Sloan will come in with 5 years of experience in the industry, or 5 years of experience doing something else, and a lot of our students are actually, they spent their time in the military. So you have people coming from all kinds of different walks, and some of them, a handful of them, are even coming from having done an MD before. So literally all kinds of different people are coming with different kinds of experience, and what they're all looking to do with the MBA is to transition into something that they wouldn't be able to do without the MBA. So my example is that I was doing economic consulting, which is basically working in a very academic application of what you're doing is you're providing expert witness testimony in a court on pharmaceutical litigation. And I was an analyst, and I was working on statistical analyses, economic analyses, and I was supporting, almost as if I was in a research lab, I was supporting an expert witness in their work and research that went to court. That was very different from what I want to get into. I want to work in biotechnology. I want to do marketing and business development. So I needed some way to make that transition. First of all, the brand of a great MBA program helps you with that. Second of all, the opportunities that you get through the recruiting process at a great great program like MIT Sloan. And third of all, you get to fill all those gaps that you don't have doing economic consulting, in my case. For example, I'm learning everything I need to know about finance. I'm learning about marketing. I'm learning about strategy. I'm learning about operations. All these toolkits that you actually do use on the job. So this summer, when I did my internship at Sanofi in the marketing department, I actually was using a lot of the things I had learned in my entrepreneurial strategy class to be able to give some kind of perspective and ability to communicate to people in the organization why this group's particular brand and product, why its product that was used in the surgical setting had commercial value, and why the company should invest in it. So that's the typical snapshot of why an MBA at Sloan is why she or he is there. I don't know for how many of you that path is a good idea if you're already in a PhD program. If you're in a master's program, that certainly might be a good idea after working a little in the industry. But if you're in a PhD program, I think what you should think about doing is doing some of that coursework while you're here, because you have access to it and it's free, and otherwise it costs you crazy amounts of money. So.
Right. So before I go on further, I think I'd be interested to know I think everybody would be interested to know how different is the life or the entire atmosphere doing an MBA different from what we usually do in MS or PhD? I mean, you must be having friends who are
Yeah. It's very different. And actually, if you do take coursework at Sloan, you'll find that people are a lot more, like I actually really enjoyed my class where I was working on a team with the two PhDs because we delved further into the work. We really spent a lot more time understanding and studying the problems versus with most MBA courses and with the load we have, our challenge is to juggle between many things. So our challenge is to know just how much you need to know and then move on. So that's one perspective. I think the whole point of the MBA program is to sort of put you through a grind of how much can you handle and drinking through a fire hose. So the vibe over there is very different. It's much more, what has to be done to get things done in a sufficient manner and when is excellence required. So you end up being, it's a very exciting environment because a lot is being thrown at you and you have to know how to prioritize it, and that's perhaps the biggest thing you're learning over there.
So would you say the course load in itself is like less in MBA, or is it comparable to what we do in MS or PhD?
My guess is that the rigor of the individual classes is less challenging, but that you're taking more coursework, so the balancing act is what is more difficult.
Okay. And lastly, I have my last question to the panel before which I open up the floor to questions. Can Shu please tell us about your company and how you perceive this idea and how you went on to co-found this company of yours?
Oh, sure. So my company is called GeriJoy. It means bring joy to geriatrics. Because what we do is we make talking dogs for lonely seniors. Because now in the U.S. there are a lot of seniors who live alone or in a nursing home, and they don't have anyone to talk to on a daily basis. So what we provide is an application running on the Android tablet, and it looks like a dog. You can touch it, it can react, and also you can talk. You can have meaningful conversations with it because the tablet is connected to the internet, and there is human at the back. So the human is kind of driving the conversation between the senior and the dog. So that's what we do. And talking about the idea, so actually it's not my idea, it's my co-founder, the CEO's idea. And he was a master's student in MIT. He graduated in 2012. And he is now working on this company as full-time. So back to 2012, he had this idea, and his major is in mechanical engineering. So he's now quite familiar with Android programming or the setting up all the network backend. So he found me through common friends from GSC. And then so he told me about this idea, and I think it's really interesting, and also it's kind of, it's very meaningful. So it feels like we are doing something good for the society. So that's why I decided to join the startup. And
So since you're a PhD student right now, do you find it really hard to kind of balance the two?
Yeah. So it can be hard sometimes because so it's like I'm working on two different projects at the same time, and but it's also kind of relaxing as my research, because I can't do research 24 hours a day. So when I'm kind of get bored of research, I do something else, and this is my something else. Yeah. So actually, I got advice from a senior student in my lab. She says you should always do something else during your PhD study, or you will feel really bored, because you just can't think about your research projects all the time. It's really it will be exhausting. So yeah, that's the so usually when I was doing my research, Most of the time I was working alone, and then I write code, write papers, and then sometimes I get stuck because, as I said, research is to solve problems that no one has solved before. And then I got stuck and I got so bored of what I'm doing. Then I switch to the co-founder's role as in a startup. Then here I'm doing totally different things. Here I know what to do. So I'm in charge of the technical side. So I have a list of problem, maybe functions to implement and bugs to fix, and then So I'm the project manager. So I always communicate with my staff, saying this is what you need to do today, and also get feedback from them. What are the problems they faced, and if they need help from me. So how can I help them? And then but also you cannot do these things all the time, because it's like so as a startup co-founder, what I'm doing most of the time is talking with people and also writing documents, like listing the things that they need to do. And if you keep just writing documents, I also get bored, because those documents are always about bugs on the website or on our software. So it's not that innovative work. Then when I get bored of this and I go back to the research, then I feel, I'm doing something interesting and challenging. So I would say the startup is kind of relaxed from the research, and the research is relaxed from the startup.
I'm just curious, so how did you, did you think about doing a startup before you came to MIT and began your PhD program, or was this sort of a new idea that came out of the blue while you were here? And then also, how did you have that conversation with your advisor? How did you broach the topic that, I'm going to stay in the PhD program, but I'm also going to put a lot of effort into the startup, and how did he or she react to it? How did you negotiate that?
Oh, sure. So talking about the ideas, the idea of building this actual product is not my idea. So I'm just helping someone to make it from an idea to a real product. Mm-hmm. And talking about the idea of doing startups,
right.
So that's what I've been thinking of doing for a long time. I feel it's really interesting. And also I got some influence from my family, because my father has his own company, maybe not a startup. So he's always encouraged me to work on startup ideas. So I got a lot of support from my family, and also my advisor is also always supportive. So he's very nice, and he is supportive for any ideas or any career path that his students choose. So I think I feel very lucky. And also my advisor is also kind of very interested in startup related mm-hmm. things, because he has already had successful startups before, and also he's doing one now. So
that's great.
So we've reached 5:30, and the event's technically supposed to be over by now. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. Please go ahead. Sure.
So I worked a little bit before starting my master's, and I've had a little bit of trouble adjusting to grad school, because at work I feel like everything that I was working on, putting time into writing, do it as well as I could, and make sure that I was delivering something, all those things. And I feel like here it's about prioritizing your own time, understanding what you should put time into at all different times. And there are so many options for things that you can't work on. Do you have any advice for how you deal with prioritizing all those things?
So there's no easy answer to that. I mean, I think that's a problem you're going to face for the rest of your life. Honestly, I think faculty have that problem in spades as well. In graduate school, I think, you maybe want to think about your end goal. I mean, what do you want to emerge from here with? I don't know if you're planning to stay for PhD or if you're trying to do a master's. And yeah. So in the long run, I mean, this actually goes back to one of the earlier questions, sort of coursework versus research. In the long run, I think what you're left with is the perspective that you get from your courses. I mean, courses can enlarge your perspective and then teach you something new, but the sort of contribution and accomplishment that you get from your research. And I think in the long run, your research is kind of that's what makes graduate school different than just another bunch of courses. So I think your priorities will gradually shift towards that over time. At the same time, you have a lot of freedom, and it's good to do extracurricular things. I mean, it's absolutely good to do something other than your research. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I played the piano and pretty seriously when I was in graduate school, and it was a good break from things, and it was a very different sort of thing. But I don't know if you can do 5 different things. You have to, at some point, really focus. So I would say, choose your activities wisely, and maybe try to get a balance in terms of what it also comes down to. What keeps you happy and what keeps you motivated and what keeps you kind of energetic, to face each day, and so you need to feed the different parts of yourself.
Okay, so my question is follow up with the startup discussion. I think the environment is pretty vibrant on that. So the question is, and I can actually also generalize the question, is like, when you have something else outside research, how you actually communicate that to your advisor, and also how you manage the expectation of the advisor, so that he knows that you're doing work, but then you're also on something else, and then to make sure that in particular, how did you divide your time between startup and research work? This is a very delicate guidance, I guess. Question that. I mean, you are lucky to have an advisor who's very understanding, but in many other cases, that may not be the case. How you deal with difficult advisor, but at the same time doing what you want to do.
Yeah, this is probably a very good
It's for
question.
everyone, yeah.
Because I have a friend who's also facing the same issue. She wants to do an externship during the holidays, but then she can't get her professor to agree with that. And also it seems professors also have a tendency to expect students to work on the research during the holidays, because during the semester they don't have much time for research, but they do coursework alone. So this also brings back one of my previous questions about keeping the balance between. So please help us out with this. This is probably a good question.
I think that the best students, well, the best students really want to wake up in the morning and do their research, and that's what. And that there's something that they're just. It's the way I was just addicted to the research, and I had other things going. In my case, it wasn't the piano or startup. In my case, it was 2 children that were born while I was a graduate student, and so when I would get back, it was full-time childcare, and then I'd wake up and go into the lab the next day, and so and so those were the 2 things that I did. But it was nice to have that distraction, that other thing. But to do well in the research in many fields, it requires a lot of work, and at the same time, when you're addicted to that work, it doesn't feel like work. It just feels like that's what you need to do and want to do. If you're in that mindset, it's pretty easy. But there certainly are cases where it's not a match. You're not excited about what you're going to do next, and you just really need to switch to something where when you get up in the morning, you really just want to go do that research. that's really the answer. But it's very simplistic to say it that way because sometimes it's very hard to find that match.
So, yeah, sure.
I can add just there's been a number of questions about prioritization and something MBAs think about a lot because we typically need to plan out our 7-year plan for getting into a school and then completing it and then what we're doing afterwards. So MBAs always go around with this 1-year, 5-year, and 10-year plan, and perhaps the better division for PhD students would be something like 1 year, 3 year, and 7 year. Like the question you want to ask in balancing things that are not pertaining to your research and your completion of your PhD is, I mean, from my perspective would be how long do you want to be here doing your PhD? How long do you want to be able to finish that? Because some of my friends have completed their PhD in like 4 or 5 years. Some have taken 7 to 8 years. Some even longer than that. I think if you stretch it out too much, it can be a little difficult. But you have to realize that if you are not going to go at it 110%, and that's not going to be all consuming, and you're going to have other priorities, it is going to take longer. So just be clear with yourself that you're going to be here, longer. I don't know if that adds any value.
So maybe,
I'll just, add one thing to echo that, if you want a career in research long term, you do have to devote yourself to it. You do have to live and breathe your research. And, early on, you might be worried about courses. And I think, first, second year students worry more about courses than they should. And if you want a career in research, whether it's in academia or in industry, I think that at some point you have to be like, look, this is what I'm doing. This is who I am. This is what's pulling me along. And you have to let yourself do that. So when it comes to prioritization, maybe you don't feel that way right away in your first year, but at some point that switch may flip, and then that's what you have to do.
And it's not a situation where it's deferred gratification, okay? Because if you're not enjoying the research, I think as a PhD student, I'm speaking from the perspective of a PhD student. If you're not enjoying that research, you're not really doing it for the credentials. Because, well, I guess I'm being a little bit simplistic because you can get your credentials, the PhD, and then go on to very interesting non-PhD careers. I said that wrong. Non-research careers, and there are many other ways to go, and many students do that. And so in that sense, you can do the PhD for the credential, and I think that's a very valid thing to do. I have a tendency to just think about it from the way the path I took and the way I felt, and in that case, I wasn't doing it for the credential, and I was doing it because I was just addicted to it, and then the next step just comes very easy, and you just stay in that academic research environment and until the end, I guess, until you drop over, and I love it, but and I don't need to really think about. Yeah, you have to find time for other things, but that's what it becomes. It becomes finding time for other things rather than forcing yourself to think about the research.
Anybody else with questions?
My question is more about as you go along the course and you kind of build up your first project, and the questions comes whether you want to switch your projects. Like, how do you make that decision, because you put in a lot of effort in the first place, and you can just continue getting negative data by the end of it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's very hard to put everything aside and start from scratch. Like, what would you recommend to your students when they are facing that situation?
It's a lot easier if you see a new opportunity that you're very excited about. Okay, if you see something else that you think is a great opportunity, then starting to work on that, maybe even part-time, to see if that can be the next project, I guess is the way to do it. But it's hard if all you know is that you don't like the project that you're on, and you don't see something else that looks like a great opportunity, then it's a lot harder.
Does that answer your question?
It's hard to answer.
Please go ahead.
Expectation with your advisor on when you graduate, or what's the sort of milestone that you need to accomplish to graduate?
So, right, this is a negotiation that always has to happen at some point. But I think honestly, I think it's better not to talk about a time, but to talk about these are the things I would like to accomplish, and to set, we would like to have, made good progress on this problem, come up with this formulation, tackled this, and that. And I think it's much easier to agree on those things. And then to some extent the time is up to, well, how do things go, and it's up to you also to some extent as well.
Does your department have thesis advisory committee meetings? And so that serves a very useful purpose for time to graduate, because one of the main purposes of that committee is to help you with that decision. When they feel that you're over the bar for a PhD, then, which is often a much lower bar than the student feels themselves, but at least getting that sense from the advisory committee. And then what often happens is the student wants to do more, and sometimes that's reasonable, and sometimes that is the best thing for their career. But then it's really in your hands, which is nice. You're in control.
So any further questions? So I think we're done. So thank you, panelists, for coming. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for attending this event.